Shaquille O'Neal's name is synonymous with power. From the start of his career in 1992, he bullied his way through the paint, stacked up 4 championships, an MVP, and 15 All-Star appearances. Most players didn't stand a chance against him, but when Shaq looks back now at 53 years old, he doesn't only talk about the nights he dominated. He talks about the opponents who pushed him, the ones who left a mark on his memory. These are the players who made life difficult for the Big Diesel, starting with the most dominant center of the 90 seconds, Hakeem Olajuwon.
The only guy that I couldn't figure out. I couldn't figure him out.
When people talk about the toughest battles of Shaquille O'Neal's career, the conversation usually starts with Hakeem Olajuwon. Shaq himself once said, "Hakeem was the only guy I couldn't intimidate," and that tells you everything. By the mid-1990 seconds, Shaq was already one of the league's brightest young stars, the face of an Orlando Magic team that had just swept the Indiana Pacers to reach the NBA Finals. On the other side stood Hakeem, the reigning champion, a veteran center with footwork and polish that no one could match. Their clash in the 1995 Finals felt like the passing of the torch. At least, that's how it was billed. Game 1 gave us a snapshot of the dynamic between them. Shaq tried to set the tone with his usual power, throwing a signature elbow and hook in the post. Hakeem absorbed it, smiled, then answered right back with a move of his own, finishing with a jumper and saying, "Right back at you, big fella." It was the kind of moment that set the stage for the series. Shaq brought raw strength, but Olajuwon carried experience, poise, and an almost unshakable calm. The finals themselves turned into a showcase for Olajuwon. Houston swept Orlando 4-0, and while Shaq still played well with 28 points, 12 rebounds, and over 6 assists per game, he was outdone at every step. Hakeem averaged nearly 33 points, along with 11 rebounds and more than 5 assists, and he outscored Shaq in all 4 games. The breakdown told the story: 31-26, 34-33, 31-28, and 35-25. Even when Shaq was producing, Olajuwon always had the last word. That Rockets team made history too. They became the lowest seed ever to win the NBA title, and they did it by running through 4 straight 50-win teams in the playoffs. Olajuwon's Finals MVP cemented his place among the greatest centers ever, and his performance against Shaq highlighted everything that made him special: unmatched footwork, elite defense, and the ability to blend skill with confidence. Shaq later admitted that during that series, he realized there was nothing he could do to break Hakeem's rhythm. The fallout of that finals was lasting. For Shaq, it was a reminder that even he wasn't invincible. The young superstar who had bullied his way past most opponents finally met someone who could stand up to him and win convincingly. For Olajuwon, it was the crowning moment of his career, proof that his championship run the year before was no fluke. The demand for their rivalry was so strong that later that year, a pay-per-view event called War on the Floor was planned, pitting Shaq and Hakeem in a one-on-one showdown. The event never happened because Olajuwon had back problems, but the idea alone shows how much fans wanted to see them battle again. Looking back now, Shaq never hesitates to put Olajuwon at the top of his toughest opponents list. He often groups him with Patrick Ewing, David Robinson, and Rick Smits. But when he talks about Hakeem, the respect is clear. "I couldn't stop him," Shaq has said, even decades later. For the Big Diesel, Olajuwon became the benchmark, the standard that every battle at center was measured against for the rest of his career. Let's stay in the 90 seconds and talk about the Knicks legend and Hall of Fame center, Patrick Ewing.
We had some tough battles, but you was always my favorite player.
Patrick Ewing's name always comes up when Shaquille O'Neal talks about the players who tested him most. In an interview with Sports Illustrated, Shaq grouped him right alongside Hakeem Olajuwon and David Robinson, calling them the toughest competitors he faced. For Shaq, Ewing wasn't just another opponent. He was one of the first players who truly intimidated him. The story goes back to Shaq's rookie year. When the Magic went to Madison Square Garden, the young center walked up to Ewing before the game, reached out his hand, and tried to show respect. Ewing wasn't having it. He looked at Shaq and said, "I'm gonna bust your ass, rookie." That line stuck with O'Neal for the rest of his career. It was a cold reminder that the NBA wasn't about friendly greetings. It was about proving yourself against giants who had already built their reputations. Ewing was also more than an opponent. He was a childhood idol for Shaq. On his own podcast, O'Neal revealed that he wore number 33 inches high school and college as a tribute to Ewing. Years later, when Ewing joined him as a surprise guest, Shaq called him his favorite player. And when asked to reflect on the great centers, O'Neal made sure Ewing's name was included, saying, A lot of people, when they talk about the greats, Patrick Ewing's name never comes up, but I'm putting Patrick Ewing's name in there.
I don't think you know this. I wore number 33 in high school and college.
On the court, their battles were physical and demanding. The two big men met 26 times in the regular season. Shaq came out ahead in the record with 15 wins to Ewing's 11. Statistically, O'Neal carried the edge as well, averaging about 29 points, 12 rebounds, and 3 blocks in those games. Ewing still held his own, putting up roughly 21 points, 11 rebounds, and 2 blocks. For every night that Shaq dominated the paint, Ewing had moments where his jumper, rebounding, and toughness kept the Knicks right in the fight. Some of their head-to-head meetings showed flashes of that old-school physicality that defined the 1990 seconds. There were games where Ewing scored into the 30 seconds and matched Shaq's strength blow for blow. There were nights where the younger O'Neal flexed his power and ran up numbers that made it clear a new generation of centers was on the rise. Together, their clashes represented a bridge between two eras, the veteran star of New York still chasing a championship and the rising force from Orlando on his way to becoming the face of the league. For Shaq, the respect only grew over time. What started with a cold handshake turned into admiration that lasted long after their playing days. Even though Ewing never won a title, O'Neal never let that diminish his place in history. He called him one of the greatest big men of all time, a player who shaped his own understanding of what it meant to compete at the highest level. The next player on the list was Shaq's idol growing up, David Robinson.
Stands one man O'Neal has yet to defeat.
Interestingly enough, Shaq probably talked the most trash about his role model. For years, he told the story of Robinson refusing to sign an autograph for him when he was a kid in San Antonio. The tale added a personal edge to their battles, fueling the idea that Shaq carried a grudge. But years later, O'Neal admitted the story was made up. In his own words, "I had to make something up just to make me mad." That invented slight became emotional gas, a way to keep himself fired up whenever he matched up with the Admiral. Shaq's respect for Robinson was real though. In an interview with Sports Illustrated, he praised him as one of the toughest players he ever faced, saying Robinson ran me into the ground every time. O'Neal went on to compliment Robinson's conditioning, team first play, and soft shooting touch. He admitted that Robinson forced him to raise his game because there were no shortcuts. In fact, in the same interview, Shaq explained how he would create mental stories to stay motivated, saying, "I made up a story in my head. That guy used to run me into the ground every time." Robinson was also named in a Yahoo Sports feature where Shaq listed the 3 guys he couldn't guard, right alongside Hakeem Olajuwon and Patrick Ewing.
Robinson, they have met 5 times, and while Shaquille has had his moments,
their actual battles were as competitive as it gets. Between regular season and playoffs, Shaq and Robinson faced off 40 times, and the record came out dead even, 20 wins apiece. In the regular season, Robinson had the slight edge, but Shaq turned the tide in the postseason, going 11-9 when it mattered most. Looking at the numbers, O'Neal averaged about 26 points, 12 rebounds, and close to 3 blocks per game against Robinson. The Admiral still put up solid production of his own, with around 19 points, 10 rebounds, and a couple of assists. Their peaks in these head-to-heads were impressive too. Both men had nights where they scored into the mid-30 seconds and pulled down close to 20 rebounds. These weren't casual matchups. Every meeting had the intensity of 2 all-time centers fighting for ground. Part of what made this rivalry unique was the contrast in styles. Robinson was known for being polished and versatile. He could run the floor, hit the mid-range jumper, and anchor the Spurs with his defense and leadership. Shaq was the opposite type of problem. He came straight at you with raw strength, size, and an attitude that made every possession a collision. When the two clashed, it was power against finesse, and each player had moments where their strengths won out. The Spurs system under Greg Popovich added another layer. Robinson always had structure and reliable teammates around him, which forced Shaq to work harder to break through double teams and organize defenses. And because Shaq had built up that fictional grudge, every matchup carried an extra level of tension. He needed that personal motivation, and Robinson was the perfect rival to bring it out.
Yeah, no, he was the man.
He was a load in the 90s.
In the end, Shaq openly calls David Robinson one of the toughest competitors of his era. He admits the stories he spun were fake, but the respect was real. Robinson pushed him physically and mentally, and their battles left Shaq with memories of just how difficult the Admiral was to handle, even for the most dominant force of his generation. Although Rick Smith's wasn't as legendary as the first 3 names on the list, he's still one of the players Shaq most trouble with.
Rick Smith used to kill me early on too, but
When Shaquille O'Neal talks about the opponents who gave him trouble, he often brings up a certain type of big man. Not the bruisers who tried to match his strength, but the tall shooters who could drag him away from the rim and punish him with touch shots from the elbows. Rick Smith fit that description perfectly. Standing 7'4" with a soft jumper and a high release, he was the kind of center who bent Shaq's defensive instincts. O'Neal admitted it himself. Rick destroyed me every time. Pick and pop, jump hook. I couldn't stop that kid. That length and face-up skill made Smits a problem in ways few others could replicate. The impact showed up early in Shaq's career. Before he became the dominant Finals MVP in Los Angeles, he was already studying tape of Smits to figure out how to adjust. Shaq has said he looked back on their battles and remembered how the Dutch center used to kill him. That acknowledgement makes Smits more than a footnote. He was a stylistic stress test for young O'Neal, one of the first players to expose the limitations of relying only on brute force. Their clashes in the 1995 Eastern Conference Finals captured the tension perfectly. The Magic and Pacers pushed each other to 7 games, and Smits delivered one of the most memorable shots of his career in Game 4. With the clock winding down in Indianapolis, he hit a buzzer beater over Orlando to win 94-93, a play remembered as the Memorial Day Miracle. It highlighted exactly how dangerous his pick and pop game could be. Even against the most physically overwhelming center in basketball, Shaq still put up big numbers that series, averaging more than 27 points. But Smith's scoring and timely shooting kept Indiana alive long enough to stretch the matchup to the limit. By the time they met again in the 2000 NBA Finals, the tables had turned. Shaq was no longer the raw young star. He was the centerpiece of the Lakers' triangle offense, playing the best basketball of his life. In that series, O'Neal unleashed one of the most dominant finals performances in history, averaging 38 points and nearly 17 rebounds per game, as Los Angeles beat Indiana in 6 games. Smits, now dealing with injuries and nearing the end of his career, later admitted the matchup felt unfair. Shaq himself explained that he entered the series determined to end the Smits problem, saying he had studied the old film and knew he had to take control right away. The finals became the proof of how much O'Neal had grown, turning a past weakness into a personal statement. Even so, the overall numbers show why Shaq never forgot about Smits. Across 35 meetings, including playoffs, Smits actually held a slight edge in wins, 18-17, with the postseason split right down the middle at 8 apiece. O'Neal still dominated statistically, averaging around 28 points and 13 rebounds in those matchups. But Smits' height, touch, and spacing consistently forced him into uncomfortable situations. It wasn't about shutting Shaq down, but about making him work harder than usual. That's why Smits ends up on Shaq's short list of opponents he admits he couldn't guard. He gets mentioned alongside names like Olajuwon and Ewing, not because of fame or championships, but because his style exposed one of the few cracks in Shaq's game. For the Big Diesel, Rick Smits became the example of a lanky shooting big man who couldn't be bullied, and who made every possession a test of patience and adaptation. Staying in the lane of big centers who had a great shooting touch, let's talk about Bryant Reeves, who some of you might know by his nickname, Big Country.
They do got a big country versus Shaq on that hoe.
When Shaquille O'Neal listed Bryant Big Country Reeves as the toughest player he had to guard, it caught a lot of people off guard. Reeves wasn't a Hall of Famer or a household name, but for Shaq, he was a genuine problem. Part of it came down to a strange, almost awkward weapon. Reeves had a one-handed jumper, sometimes called a Duckworth-style shot, and even though it looked ugly, it kept dropping. Shaq admitted he couldn't figure it out, and the respect he gave Reeves surprised a lot of fans who had overlooked the Grizzlies' big man. What made the matchup frustrating for O'Neal was that Reeves' stroke worked in places where Shaq wasn't comfortable defending. In the paint and from mid-range, Reeves had a reliable, high-arcing shot that forced O'Neal to contest in space. At the same time, Reeves wasn't undersized or easy to push around. At nearly 7 feet tall and well over 275 pounds, he had the strength to hold his ground. That meant Shaq couldn't simply overpower him the way he did with so many others. O'Neal later confessed, "I couldn't stop him at all. I don't know what it was." The mix of touch and bulk turned Reeves into a puzzle he couldn't quite solve.
I'm looking at the stats. Shaq 15, Big Country 26.
Reeves also stayed consistent, even as injuries chipped away at his career. When he was healthy, he always seemed to give Shaq more trouble than expected. Those awkward-looking jumpers and his ability to absorb contact made the battles unpredictable. And even though Reeves didn't pile up accolades, he managed to carve out a place in Shaq's memory. Few players could say they were a thorn in the side of one of the most dominant centers ever, but Big Country earned that distinction. Shaq's acknowledgement elevated Reeves far beyond the numbers. For a player whose career only lasted 6 seasons and who averaged just under 13 points a game, being named as one of Shaq's toughest opponents gave him a kind of legacy stats alone never could. Reeves often shows up in lists of guys Shaq couldn't guard, and while it sounds surprising on the surface, it shows how even the most dominant players can run into quirky matchups that throw them off. For O'Neal, Bryant Reeves was one of those rare unsolved problems, a reminder that not every battle is won by raw power alone. And the last player we'll talk today might not be known by your average fan, but don't get it twisted. Dino Radda was definitely one of Shaq's toughest opponents.
He mentioned you as one of the toughest white centers.
Dino Radda was born on April 24, 1967, in Split, back when it was still part of Yugoslavia. He grew up in a basketball hotbed that produced some of Europe's greatest talents, and by the late 1982s, he was already a rising star across the continent. The Boston Celtics drafted him in 1989, taking him in the second round with the 40th pick. But he stayed overseas for a few more years before making the leap to the NBA. Radda finally joined Boston in 1993, and over the course of 4 seasons in the league, he became a steady contributor. He averaged about 17 points, 8 rebounds, nearly 2 blocks, and a couple of assists per game. His best campaign came in 1995-96, when he put up close to 20 points and 10 boards on nearly 50% shooting from the field. That year cemented him as one of the few bright spots for a Celtics team that was struggling in the post-Larry Bird era.
When you play Shaquille O'Neal, you cannot go.
His career went far beyond Boston. In Europe, Radda won a EuroLeague title, captured multiple Greek League championships, and built a reputation as one of the best big men of his generation. Alongside Vlade Divac and Arvydas Sabonis, he represented the first wave of European centers to cross into the NBA and prove they could compete at the highest level. In 2018, his achievements were recognized with induction into the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame. When Shaquille O'Neal was asked about his toughest opponents, one name surprised nearly everyone: Dino Radda. On his podcast and in interviews, Shaq called him the toughest white guy I went up against. He even doubled down with a direct quote: "The hardest matchup for me was a guy from Boston. His name was Dino Radda." That statement raised eyebrows, but Radda himself confirmed that their battles were intense. Reflecting on the mid-1990 seconds, he said, "He couldn't stop me. My third year, we had like 5 games against them, and I averaged like 27 against Orlando." He definitely remembers that. Basketball writers summed it up well, noting that Shaq's comments shocked the masses. But Dino left an impression. Radda also had his own perspective on facing Shaq. He explained that O'Neal's entire game was built on overwhelming strength. When he gets the ball in the post, there's nothing you can do. If you try to push him in the post, it feels like you're pushing a truck. The best way was to hit him on the arm. He was terrible at free throws. He didn't care if he went 2 for 1, 5 or 4 for 2-0. That was completely normal in his world. That quote ties into the hack-a-Shaq tactic, where coaches instructed their players to foul O'Neal and send him to the line. It slowed him down, but it never neutralized him. Against Radda, though, the battles were fierce enough that both players remembered them years later. O'Neal and Radda faced each other 16 times between regular season and playoffs. Shaq held the upper hand in terms of results, winning 10 of those matchups, including a 3-1 advantage in the postseason. The Celtics were rarely contenders in those years, but Radda's personal numbers made him stand out in the box scores. Statistically, Shaq dominated as expected. He averaged roughly 30 points, 12 rebounds, and 3 assists per game against Radda, numbers in line with his production against most centers of that decade. But what makes these meetings memorable is that Radda didn't fold. He averaged about 22 points, 8 rebounds, and hit more than 50% of his shots from the field. His best stretch came in the 1994-95 season, when he put up 27 points and 9 rebounds a night on 56% shooting against Orlando. Those games proved he could score efficiently, even when battling one of the most physically imposing players the league had ever seen. The rivalry never produced a classic playoff series or a final showdown, but it earned Radda lasting respect. For O'Neal, Radda wasn't a star who blocked his path to championships. He was a reminder that toughness and skill could come from unexpected places, even during an era dominated by American big men. Shaq's praise elevated Rada's profile long after his NBA career ended, turning their clashes into a unique footnote in basketball history. Shaquille O'Neal's career was full of dominance, but the names he remembers most are the ones who pushed back. These 6 guys all left their mark on the Big Diesel. Their battle shaped his legacy, and his respect for them proves it. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more basketball stories.